Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program on Valley Veterans Forum. Our guest tonight is retired Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Hayes, U.S. Navy, who has the distinctive identity of serving through three separate wartime eras: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. If you include the Cold War that has occurred on and off in between, that would be four. Moreover, he wore two different colors of shoes during his naval career, both brown and black, and served in the Merchant Marine thereafter to boot. Without stealing any more of his thunder, I am pleased to welcome Bob Hayes to Valley Veterans Forum to tell us about his life and experiences before, during, and after his military career. Bob, welcome to the show. Where would you like to begin?
Thank you. Well, I was born in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois in 1925, and I went to four different high schools because my father was a school superintendent who changed his job each year. In 1942, Navy recruiter came around to the school and said that the war is not going well for us in the Pacific. How would you like to learn how to fly and go out and be a part of our wartime effort? And I said, certainly I would, not thinking that if the Japanese were shooting down our best pilots, what would they do to a new man like me? But I went ahead and signed up, and my folks, I guess, were very happy they didn't have to worry about my college, because the Navy had promised us college at the end of the tour. I went through various pre-flight schools at University of Texas in Austin, Texas, St. Mary's College in Moraga, and I went through primary in Norman, Oklahoma. And after I got my wings, I went out to the Pacific. And the thing I remember about World War II most is being in Manila Bay, staging for the invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost island in Japan. And we were ready to go in August of '45 when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this, in effect, changed everything for us. I was 20 years old, flying a hot airplane, and I had mixed emotions about the bomb. But we had been given briefings about the invasion, and we were told that 1 out of every 2 of us would become a casualty, and that we would have to kill 90% of the Japanese population, including women and children, because they were so set against us and so set against surrender. But they did surrender, and we became part of the occupation instead of the invasion. I was reassigned to the Mars Squadron, VR-2, out of Alameda. The Mars is rather unique in that it was a 4-engine flying boat designed to carry a fully equipped infantry company to the scene of the action, which would be an atoll in the South Pacific, and land and come back and get some more fighters. The Mars was the largest seaplane at the time, before the Spruce Goose. The Mars had a crew of 17, including 3 pilots, 2 navigators, 4 radiomen, 4 mechanics, and some other personnel. There was one old chief with several stripes, hash marks on his sleeve, that I didn't know what his job was, and I, being a new ensign, I wasn't about to ask him.
Then you were assigned to a transport squadron with the JRM-2.
Well, yes, she was strictly for carrying that company. But when the war ended, she no longer had a mission, so we were told that we had to show the flag, and we'd take off from Alameda, go to Kihei Lagoon in Honolulu. It's since been dredged up and is now the main runway at Honolulu International. From there we might go to French Frigate Shoals, Johnson Island, then on to the Marshalls and land at Majuro Atoll, then to the Marianas, land at Saipan, go on to Manila, hang a left, go down through Singapore and Kuala Lumpur and on into Australia, and come back just to show the flag. Because in 1945, Americans were all heroes. We were welcome anywhere in the world at that time.
You were, then shortly after that, you were assigned to fly DC-4s, or the military version is called the C-54?
The Navy called it the R-5D. It was a 4-engine transport. We'd fly to Honolulu and on out to the east, never above 8,000 feet. It was an unpressurized aircraft.
Then in 1946, the year I was born, you were abruptly assigned a change in the Navy. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, the Navy wanted to save money, so the junior aviators lost their flight skins, so to speak, and we were assigned to the surface Navy, or the black shoe Navy, meaning that they wore black shoes with their khakis. I thought this, at first I thought this was a demotion, but it turned out to be pretty nice, because for those of you who have served on destroyers, you know that it's one big family. And I was lucky to serve on the Henry W. Tucker, which was engaged in a round-the-world voyage at that time.
You're I see you're a landing force officer and an anti-air gunnery officer?
Yes, as a new ensign on board this destroyer, I was assigned rather strange jobs. I was laundry officer, morale officer, and landing force officer. This latter assignment meant that I would get personnel from each division aboard ship to amount to about 30 people, and go ashore and take care of any civil disturbance which might occur there. So we got the word that a Marine lieutenant had pancaked his F-4U in the area above Ching Wang Tao. And so we were told to take our landing force ashore, burn the airplane, and bring back the pilot if we could get him. So we went ashore and found the airplane and set it on fire, and I was amazed how aluminum burns when it's hot. And we went on to the village, and we were taken under fire. I don't know, probably blunderbusses, because they didn't hit anybody. We had no casualties, but we fired back. Could see the shots go everywhere, because none of the members of the landing force were trained in small arms fire. But we found the pilot who had been on a diet of raw eggs and rice, and took him back to the beach where the heavy cruiser St. Mary's came in. She had medical personnel aboard, and so we turned the pilot over to her, and then we went back to the ship. And didn't think any more about this, but sometime later we got a call from Sink Westpac, Commander-in-Chief, West Pacific Forces, 4-star Admiral, wanted to talk to Ensign Hayes. I'd never seen an admiral before. I didn't know how to act, really. But I knew I was in trouble when the junior man to see me into the offices was a 4-striper, then a 2-star admiral, and then the 4-star admiral. And he wanted to know why I almost participated in an international situation here. And we were not at war with those people, and we shouldn't have shot at them. And it didn't make any difference to him that we were fired on first. But he said, you may be getting a court-martial. So I went back to the ship expecting to be court-martialed, but the Navy instead, in order, I guess, to forestall any embarrassment, gave me an award. Good. And no court-martial.
Good for them. In 1947, you were on the U.S.S. Samuel N. Moore. Tell us about that experience.
Well, that was a short assignment. I went on there to replace another officer who had to be discharged from the Navy. And I was on the deck division there and stayed there until I was assigned to Commander Amphibious Forces Pacific as aide and flag lieutenant.
In 1949, you were assigned to McGill University to attend polar climatology and school and study Soviet geopolitics.
That's true. The admiral asked me, I was due for reassignment, he asked me where I wanted to go, and I said I'd like to go to the school in McGill. So he wrote me up a set of orders, and I went up there, and I met my first wife up there, in Montreal, Canada. And it was a good school, but nothing that I could use later on in my assignments, because I never got into any real cold climate. I was sent to Panama instead.
Then in 1948 and 49, you were a staff command, amphib force?
Yes, I was. That was when I was aide and flag lieutenant. And in 1950, we were doing exercises in the Far East, and just a few miles off of the western part of Korea, when the North Koreans came down and invaded. And so we were immediately in the war right away. And MacArthur was assigned as commander-in-chief, and he set up a lot of staffs to take care of the invasion plan he had for the port of Incheon. Incheon had 33 feet of tide, which meant every 12 hours the water would change. And it required real close planning to avoid disaster, because when the water went out, when the tide went out, there was 3 miles of mud. And I saw one tank that was dropped in the mud and disappeared.
Before we go on with your story, since this is a lead up to Korea, we're going to insert a little 25-minute documentary that in detail shows our entry and exit from Korea.
Okay.
And then when we come back, we'll take up your Korean War experiences.
Okay.
Okay?
This is Korea, the first great confrontation of the Cold War. Pacific. Sitting precariously between Russia, China, and Japan, Korea was always at the mercy of its bigger neighbors. For centuries, foreign conquerors trampled over Korean soil to do battle with each other. As World War II came to a close, the peninsula was up for grabs after decades of Japanese rule. In July of 1945, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin joined forces with the United States to pinch the Japanese out of Korea with a two-prong attack from north and south. The superpowers met at the 38th parallel, the line of latitude running through the middle of the peninsula. They agreed to split and occupy Korea along that line. The Soviets would control the northern half, while the U.S. took the southern half, each set to work honing a government modeled in its own image. When the superpowers pulled out in 1947, they left behind two starkly different regimes. In the north, zealous puppets of communist Russia and China took control. In the South, a Princeton-educated autocrat named Syngman Rhee emerged. Both sides wanted the other eliminated. Threats grew stronger, spies more numerous, and violence more prevalent along the border. This little peninsula wasn't big enough for both of them. The question was, who would draw first blood? At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, the armies of North Korea stormed across the 38th parallel, hoping to crush the South in one overwhelming offensive. 135,000 communists besieged a ragtag South Korean border patrol and steamrolled southward. At outposts all along the border, South Koreans and their American military advisors were overrun, caught completely off guard. The U.S. had deprived South Korea of weapons and ammunition, thinking it might invade the North and start a war. Syngman Rhee, the South's fiery and aggressive leader, had threatened to do so. All that held him back was a lack of firepower. Now, the U.S. strategy of restraint had backfired. The South was on the receiving end, with nothing to defend itself against the communist tanks and heavy artillery. In just 2 days, Seoul, the South Korean capital lying 30 miles below the parallel, was captured by the North. North Korea hoped the U.S. would look the other way and let the South be taken. But the American home front was being whipped into a frenzy over communist aggression. If South Korea fell to the Reds, would Japan be next? Sensing public outrage, President Harry Truman immediately called for U.S. air and sea strikes against North Korean targets.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away, but what is happening there is important to every American. An act of aggression such as this creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. This is a direct challenge to the efforts of free nations to build the kind of world in which men can live in freedom and peace. This challenge has been presented squarely. We must meet it squarely.
Truman called on the United Nations to lead a police action against North Korea.
The prompt action of the United Nations to put down lawless aggression and the prompt response to this action by free peoples all over the world will stand as a landmark in mankind's long search for a rule of law among nations.
Douglas MacArthur, the commander-in-chief of Far East forces and a legendary World War II general, would face a great challenge as leader of operations. A supremely confident man with a larger-than-life presence, MacArthur was the face of America to the Asian world. His cherished military legacy would be put to the test in Korea. It quickly became clear that this was no police action. This was war. And unless support arrived in a hurry, it would be a short one. The North Koreans were pushing steadily south toward Busan, and UN troops faced a real possibility of being driven into the sea. The first American strategy was to dig in along the front and set up blockades. But time and again, the North Koreans would move around them and block from the rear. Unit after unit was trapped in enemy territory. By July 20th, only a small corner of South Korea was left to conquer. The United Nations was losing the race against time. By mid-August, the United Nations had built up enough manpower to level the playing field. Units arrived through the port of Busan from nations as diverse as France, Turkey, Thailand, and Ethiopia. The British Commonwealth forces, drawing men from Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were also important contributors. Most of these men were too young for World War II. They were eager to make their own mark on this new battlefield, but few of them could comprehend the harsh realities of war that awaited them. It offered a secure beachhead from which to launch attacks on Kimpo Airfield and Seoul, 25 miles away. But the operation called for amphibious teams to land on a small beach, scale a seawall, and attack directly into a city. It would require soldiers of unparalleled bravery. MacArthur created a special 10th Corps to carry out the operation. Divisions from the Army, Marines, and Navy were pulled from the action around Pusan to lead the charge. As the soldiers set sail for Incheon, they reflected on what lay ahead.
As soon as we pulled out of Pusan, we began to get the briefings on the tide situation in the Incheon harbor area. None of us ever had any experience operating under such tidal conditions before, let alone ever having been involved in an amphibious landing. As soon as the morning of September 15th approached, we realized that we had all the ingredients for disaster on our hands. Ensign George Gilman, USS Mount McKinley.
MacArthur's gamble was a rousing success, and no one was more delighted than the great general. But his thoughts quickly turned to the real prize that lay just over the horizon. On September 29, 1950, dignitaries flew into Kimpo and made their way to Seoul for a celebration. It was full of pomp and pageantry. The United Nations wanted the world to know that their police action was well in hand. But snipers could still be heard in the distance during the ceremony, an audible reminder of the dangers still lurking on the horizon. In September of 1950, the momentum was shifting dramatically in favor of the United Nations. The Eighth Army was pushing northward at a pace that recalled Patton's drive across France after Normandy. The first objective was to reach the 38th parallel, where the war began, to reclaim South Korea's old borders. In Washington, tough choices had to be made. Should the United Nations continue the drive into North Korean soil? Would this overstep the mandate of a police action? There were no easy answers. U.S. commanders heard rumors that Communist China was moving large numbers of troops north into Manchuria. The Chinese resented American intervention in the region and feared that hostilities would spill over into their Manchurian territory. Intelligence reports estimated that up to 450,000 Chinese troops were lurking in the hills beyond the Yalu River, poised to strike. But these warning signs were cast aside by Americans thirsting for an unconditional victory. After the World Wars, anything less would be a disappointment. On October 25, 1950, the silent fears of the United Nations were confirmed. The Chinese that had been quietly amassing between the U.N. forces and the Yalu River suddenly made their presence known. In the Central Mountains, thousands of American troops were ambushed and surrounded by a massive Chinese division. Entire battalions were caught off guard and decimated. General MacArthur watched from a distance as his forces crumbled in November 1950. Korea would be his final crusade, and a resounding victory there would have assured his immortality. But that victory, imminent just days ago, was slipping away. His frustration was immeasurable, and most of it was directed at the Truman administration. Truman had limited MacArthur's resources to prevent him from attacking China. He imposed airspace restrictions that forbade U.S. fighters from chasing Chinese planes beyond the Korean border, and he limited the amount of manpower and equipment that was sent to the front. MacArthur found these restraints crippling. On November 28th, he sent a message of warning to the Pentagon. We face an entirely new war. Our present strength of force is not sufficient to meet this undeclared war by the Chinese. This command has done everything humanly possible within its capabilities, but now is faced with conditions beyond its control and its strength. General MacArthur. The relationship between the president and his general, never entirely cooperative, was disintegrating as quickly as the UN's field position. Like its advance 2 months earlier, the UN's retreat gathered momentum as it went. The mass exodus of soldiers was eclipsed only by that of petrified North Korean civilians. Thousands were eager to defect. Their restlessness may have been inspired by UN-sponsored leaflets like these that were airdropped over North Korean villages. The leaflets warned of the dangers of communism and touted the freedom of Western ideals. Disgruntled with their treatment in North Korea, thousands fled south. Meanwhile, the Chinese charge continued. As Christmas approached, UN morale was desperately low. The men resented the limitations being imposed by Washington. Their complaint, which would be echoed 15 years later in another Asian conflict, was that they weren't being allowed to use their superior force to win. By January of 1951, the Chinese had pushed United Nations forces back to the drawing board with a frightening display of manpower. But they were quickly running out of steam. They were overextended and in dire need of supplies. They wouldn't be able to sustain an offensive much longer. Commander Ridgway was confident the days of retreat would soon be over.
I find it difficult to understand the motives of the Chinese Communist leaders in continuing their aggression. Surely by now it must be clear to them beyond any shadow of doubt that they are incapable with their own resources of destroying the United Nations forces in Korea or of driving them into the sea, as they continue to boast they will.
The general launched a task force named Operation Wolfhound to investigate the communist weakness. It set out north in the direction of Seoul. Ridgway was more concerned with destroying the Chinese army than with regaining territory. Under his watch, Korea would become a showdown between expendable UN firepower and expendable Chinese manpower. By March 15, 1951, the rejuvenated forces gnawed their way back within striking distance of the 38th parallel, all the way to Seoul's doorstep. They bombarded the city limits with heavy artillery and pried the communists from the city once again. There was no celebration this time. After 4 invasions, Seoul was in shambles. It was business as usual. UN forces pressed on and reached the 38th parallel by the end of March. It had been 6 months since the first invasion of North Korea, and again there was a debate over how far this offensive should go. This time, President Truman wanted a settlement. As he saw it, the first attempt at uniting Korea had proven to be a mistake, and a second attempt would only waste more American lives. MacArthur had a different view. He insisted that the campaign against China be widened to include blockades of its coast and airstrikes on the Chinese mainland. Truman had had enough. He announced to the world that he was firing General MacArthur.
It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
It was an ideal field position to bring to the truce table. Total victory over the Chinese might take years and cost countless American lives. So Ridgway wired Washington to say the time to talk peace was now. President Truman and his Joint Chiefs concurred. It was time to extend the olive branch. At the end of June 1951, the United Nations offered to talk peace with North Korea. 2 days later, the Communists replied in kind. It was encouraging news. For the talks, the truce team settled on the tiny village of Panmunjom, between enemy lines. Right away, it was obvious that the negotiations would be as torturous as the war itself. Both sides came to the table acting as the victor, pressing the other to make concessions expected of the loser. Their objectives differed drastically. The UN wanted a new border drawn along current front lines. The Communists called for a return to the 38th parallel. The Chinese demanded that all their prisoners be returned, even against their will. But the Reds had slaughtered most of the UN captives they had taken. Of the more than 100,000 UN soldiers thought captured by the Reds, only about 13,000 came back. Relieved just to be alive, those lucky few told horrifying tales of torture, brainwashing, and severe hunger. They talked about the Chinese campaign to re-educate them and turn them against the cause of democracy. They were forced at gunpoint to speak out against America on the radio. And they described prison camps where there was no medicine and rampant disease. Thousands went crazy. Thousands more starved to death. But the talks at Panmunjom went on and off with no progress. If negotiations were going to get anywhere, UN forces needed to find a better way to put pressure on the Reds. So they turned to their most obvious advantage: air power. If there was one unquestionable imbalance in this war, it was UN air superiority. From the first day of UN intervention in Korea until the final day of battle, American aircraft pulverized North Korea ceaselessly from above. Most planes in the UN fleet were built during World War II, like the B-29 Super Fortresses that still dominated bombing operations. But a new generation of U.S. fighter planes was gradually being introduced and kept pilots a step ahead of the enemy. Jet planes like the F-86 Sabre ushered in a new era for aerial combat and quickly became the air war's main attraction. They replaced slower fighters with a more aerodynamic wing design, and they were faster and deadlier than anything that came before them. With the world's greatest aces in their cockpits, UN jets ruled the skies. In 1952, UN air power reached its peak strength. The U.S. Air Force had nearly 1,500 planes flying missions that year, and more from the Navy, Marines, and other UN squadrons. That summer, a massive show of force was unleashed over North Korean skies, meant to force the communist hand at the peace table. The Air Force descended on a remote corner of North Korea just below the Yalu, where the country's largest industrial targets were hidden. But this was where the Chinese had their only strong fleet of fighter planes, so UN pilots were prepared for anything. On June 23rd, U.S. dive bombers and jets launched an intense string of attacks on several major industrial centers. The primary targets were hydroelectric plants. Air Force Sabres flew top cover on the lookout for Chinese MiGs, while bombers moved in and hit the plants. The attacks were swift, sudden, and perfectly executed. When the smoke cleared 2 days later, 90% of North Korea's electrical capacity had been destroyed. These airstrikes would stand as the most vital of the war, and they didn't escape the notice of South Korea's leader, Syngman Rhee.
Your planes hit enemy military centers. They hit the communist columns. Everybody knows that American planes played the most important part in this war.
Korea was the hot-button issue of the 1952 American presidential campaign. With voters running low on patience, the Democrats faced an uphill challenge against the Republican nominee, legendary General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike had commanded Allied forces in Europe during World War II and had retired earlier in the year from America's most prestigious command. Even MacArthur played second fiddle to Ike. Harry Truman had served as president for more than 7 years and decided not to seek another term. As the Korean conflict entered its third year, Americans were afraid the war would drag on forever and wanted a leader who could end it quickly. In a late October stump speech, Eisenhower managed to put their fears to rest.
I shall go to Korea. Only in that way could I learn how best to serve the American people in the cause of peace.
Up to this point in the war, the communists had been emboldened by the U.N.'s self-imposed limitations. But they took Ike's nuclear warnings seriously. Just 3 months after Eisenhower's inauguration, the Chinese cracked. They sent a letter declaring their desire to end the war. But the war's finale would be as tense as its beginning. The armistice took another 4 months to iron out. Along the front, soldiers on both sides knew the end was near and wanted to go out with the best field position possible. Hostilities broke out across the peninsula in last-ditch attempts to gain ground. The armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953, more than 3 years after the war began. It divided the peninsula along the front lines, in effect giving the U.N. a small victory. In the field, artillery blasts kept rolling for another 12 hours until the agreement took effect. Then, all was quiet.
Yes, on the Incheon invasion, I was a member of the Navy intelligence staff, and the Marines went ashore and didn't find that they had much in the way of opposition. My job there was enemy body count. I would go ashore and count the enemy bodies, and most of them were young kids, maybe 16 years old. The Marines made short work of that invasion, and we successfully cut the North Korean supply line to the south. If we hadn't have done this, they would have probably pushed us down to the Pusan perimeter, which they did later in another part of the war. But my job in the Incheon invasion also involved distribution of the top secret operation order to every command which to be concerned with the invasion. And had I mismanaged or lost any of that material, I probably would still be in Leavenworth.
We don't want to think about that. you were on the McKinley during the Incheon phase, and
Yes.
then thereafter, I'm not sure what year, you can remember this, you were assigned to the USS Pittsburgh, a heavy cruiser.
Yes, I was on the McKinley and the El Dorado because they were that's where he had his flag, the three-star admiral, and also MacArthur had his staff aboard the Mount McKinley, and later on, I was assigned to the Pittsburgh out of Norfolk, and our job was conduct Cold War operations in the Mediterranean Sea.
And 54, 55, you made lieutenant, and you were in Norfolk.
Yes, I was assigned as Provost Marshal at the Norfolk Navy Base, and my job there was to process Navy offenders to Leavenworth and other brigs around the country. But I soon found out that the most important part of the job was keeping the admiral's wife, captain's wife happy, and not give them tickets when they sped or parked illegally on the base. My predecessor went by the book, and he was assigned to Diego Suarez, which is a little dot in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Don't make those kind of mistakes. I see in 1955-56 you were on the USS Cogswell.
Cogswell. She was out of San Diego, and I was served in 2 deployments to the Far East on her. I was the operations officer, and we were there to unofficially, of course, harass Russian shipping. And the procedure was, if we saw a silhouette hull down on the horizon, we determined from our spot cards whether she was a Russian or not. And if she was, we'd make turns for 32 knots and swing around and pass under her stern close aboard, and then come around and come alongside and take the pictures. And sometimes they reacted friendly. They'd wave and take pictures of us, but at other times they tried to collide with our ship. Of course, a destroyer can move faster than a merchant ship, so I was never in danger of a collision on a Cogswell.
I see that then you were, in 57, you were inspector in the San Diego, readiness inspector?
Yes, it was our job to check the operational readiness of various ships, including carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. And they didn't always pass. The Midway had a lot of problems because of excess paint on the winches and so forth. And we used to call her the halfway because they didn't always go along with our recommendations.
Then in 58, 59, you finally got your chance to go to college on the at government expense, a promise that you had been made many years earlier when you joined.
Yes, the Navy sent me to Tulane University in New Orleans because I had listed that as my 3rd choice back in 45, and they finally saw fit to assign me, and it was pretty good duty. I got to wear civilian clothes, but drew full pay and allowances, and I lived in the French Quarter for a while.
Thereafter, you were on in 1960, you joined the crew of the USS Noble.
Yes, the Noble needed a first lieutenant, which I was assigned to because they had a mission to bring back casualties from the Far East, various commands. So I served on board her for 2 years.
In 61, you were beach master.
Yes, I was exec of the beach master. The beach master has the job of controlling the beach when there are landings, and also to advise the underwater demolition teams of where the beach need to be cleared.
Then in 1962, we were seeing a buildup already in Vietnam, and you had several assignments. A staff joint?
Yes, I was sent out to JUSMAG, which is Joint United States Military Advisory Group. And we knew that war was coming, and my job was to check different areas where we could insert our troops for the best effect. We knew that the North Koreans had superior forces, which they did, and they sent down. And for a while there, things didn't go well for us until we got additional personnel out there.
Shortly thereafter, you were sent to jungle school, and then another school in
Yes,
Canada.
while in Vietnam, I was trying to practice to win the hearts and minds of the people, or counterinsurgency it was called. Mm-hmm. And it didn't take long for me to discover that this was not working. The villages were okay for us in the daytime, but at night the VC took over, and we were not able to effectively occupy that area. So the Navy, in its wisdom, sent me back to the Schools Command in Coronado, where I was to teach counterinsurgency, which I knew wasn't working in Vietnam. So I lasted about 30 days in that assignment.
Then 64-65, you were assigned to CEDO headquarters, Dominican Republic.
Yes, there was an election being planned in the Dominican Republic, and one candidate was a communist, a buddy-buddy with Castro. The other candidate we supported, and we wanted to interfere with this election because we were afraid at that time of the domino theory. In other words, if the Dominican Republic became communist, other countries in the Caribbean would also. So I said, yes, I'd like to have that assignment, because I knew that it was a boondoggle in that we would be assigned to 5-star hotels on the beach and not really have any duties. And I didn't know what my job was, but I volunteered to serve on the staff of a brigadier general who had a brigade of the 101st Airborne down there to supervise the election. And the people resented our presence, and they would do all sorts of things, like we would give the kids jawbreakers, candy, and they'd put them in slingshots and shoot out our windows of our Jeeps. But one afternoon, I was going across country for some deal, I guess, probably a barbecue. But we were ambushed by the rebels, and they got my driver, and I was wounded and air evac'd out. They had nothing against me. They gave me morphine, I remember, and called the American forces, and they came to get me in a helicopter, then took me to a C-130, and I was rehabbed to San Juan, Puerto Rico, 5 months. And following that, I went before a medical board, and they said what no professional Navy man wants to hear is unfit for sea duty. So I went ahead and took a medical retirement.
And that was when you were just 40?
I was 43 years old.
43 years old. So then you're a man that's retired with still have plenty of energy. Then you decided you wanted to see more of the world through the Merchant Marine.
Yes, I joined up in the Merchant Marine because everybody knew that they made a lot of money. In fact, I made more money as a second mate in the Merchant Marine than I did as a lieutenant commander in the Navy. And I went through the Coast Guard schools to qualify for mate in the Merchant Marine, and I found out quickly there's a lot I didn't know about rules of the road. But I managed to pass, and I was third mate on one ship called the Junior, and then I was second mate on another one called the Tavivis. These were out of San Francisco by United Fruit Company, and our job was to bring various foodstuffs to the Vietnamese, the Vietnam area, mostly for the Officers Club. And as you probably know, 5% of any cargo that the Merchant Marine hauls can be written off as spoilage, spillage, theft, or breakage. And my friend was a bosun on board and in charge of the cargo, so I ended up with some very exotic food like caviar and smoked eel and stuff. Part of the 5%.
Well, good. Now tell us a little bit about your post-military, your civilian life.
Well, I came up to Fresno because I thought I had a job with Boise Cascade to promote their recreational area up at Groveland. And it didn't last very long because it seemed that Boise Cascade was misrepresenting some of the property, and that there was no water on it, or it didn't have the views that they said they had of Half Dome. So they had a class action suit, and we lost our jobs. But I stayed in Fresno and met my present wife, Diane, here, and decided I might as well be a flight instructor. And so I passed all the tests for instructor, multi-engine, instrument, and so forth, and managed to accumulate 31,000 hours. And I quit flying a couple of years ago because the FAA thought that one of the pills I was taking for enlarged prostate would cause me to become spatially disoriented. Well, I went up and taught aerobatics and proved them wrong, but they still took my instructor's license, and my entire aviation stopped right there.
But you did have an illustrious flight career here, and you had mentioned earlier that you've worked with Mr. Mazie for years. I guess pretty much had quite a few experiences. The last one I think we can probably touch on here is the one where you had to make an emergency landing with one of his planes.
Yes. Fred Mazie, who was Mr. Aviation of Fresno, gave me a job of flying a Mixmaster. That's a Cessna 337, center line thrust, one engine ahead and one in back. And I was to take two scientists with me, and we would fly out 100 miles and turn around. And in the process, we would check the migration of the whales from the Arctic area down to Scammons Lagoon in Baja. And previously they had planted, I guess, a transducer in the flippers, and we had instruments on board this airplane that could pick up individual animals, so we knew pretty much about it. But that morning at 6:30, I'd put 136 gallons in the tanks of this airplane, and I knew that was close to what it would really could really fly on. But about 5 o'clock we were coming back, and I thought we had plenty of gas, but the rear engine quit between Catalina and Long Beach. And I didn't worry about that too much because I knew it would fly okay on one engine. So we went a little further along, and then the other engine quit, and I became a glider. And I declared an emergency, and Fullerton wanted me to try to make their airport, and I said no way because of those high-rise structures around the airport. So I set up to land on the beach at Newport, and I was all set up, but there, as you know, there are lifeguard towers there, and I'd have to bring one wing up to miss the tower, but I managed to land. Tide was out, and I missed everybody. There was no injury, no damage done, except to the airplane, of course, the belly. I left the gear up, and this was at 53rd Street on the island, close to the mayor's house, and he noticed all the turmoil out there in the airplane, and he comes out with a martini, and he gives it to me, and I pass it to one of the scientists who knew enough about flying to be really scared. The other guy, I think, thought it was routine, but I gave the martini to the other guy who was kissing the ground, and I called Fred Mazie and told him what had happened, and he said, well, get a rent-a-cop, watch that airplane at night because there's some expensive equipment in there. So I made a phone call and found out a rent-a-cop cost $13 an hour. Well, Fred was only paying me $12 an hour to fly the airplane, so I said, I'll be the rent-a-cop. So I slept in the airplane along with my wife's son, and I was amazed at the number of people on the beach at all hours of the night. But the next morning, they came out and took the wings off, put it on a lowboy and took it to Fullerton. And a cop came up and gave me a ticket for unauthorized parking of a vehicle overnight on the beach. Insurance paid it. It was $25.
Oh, good.
And Fred, they put the airplane back together in the hangar at Fullerton, and Fred called me up and said, hey, you want to fly again this weekend? I said, no.
Well, that's about wraps up the time we have for our show today, but I want to thank you for coming here tonight and spending time with us and telling us about some of your experiences and making this a very enjoyable program. And I want to thank our viewers for coming in. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us tonight on Valley Veterans Forum, and we look forward to coming back again and doing another show.